It's the Lekker Rugby Inside Story series.
Well, a pleasure to welcome back John Robbie, my good friend. It's been a while. He's been quite busy. It's been a bit of a challenge to get a time that we can sit down and talk again. But John, I'm so happy to have you back. And I want to talk to you about the Lions today. But welcome back, firstly.
Man, it's great to be here. I'm worried you think I've been ducking you, but having been incredibly not busy for a long time, I've just had a couple of weeks with visitors over and jobs coming up and so on. But I'm delighted to be here, and what a lot to talk about.
Oh, one of the challenges we had was that you had to postpone our meeting to have breakfast with Murray Mexted, of all people. Talk to me about that a bit.
Yeah, Murray Mexted, what a legend. Number 8, one of the greatest players that has ever played. Number 8 for New Zealand. I first met him in my very first game in South Africa when I came to live here in 1981. They used to have a game called the Rakes game. I'm not sure if they do. It was a selected team against Wits University, and it was always the very first game of the season, played in front of a full house at the Wits Stadium there by Wits University. And I was playing my first game. I was a British and Irish Lion. I was so nervous. You know, this was my chance to make a mark with Transvaal Rugby. And so I was there like 2 hours beforehand, strapping myself up, looking at the pitch, checking the weather, and so on. And they said, no, Murray Mexted's playing number 8. And I said, oh, that's great. I can't wait. What a great player. So at about 20 minutes before kickoff, Murray Mexted breezes in, in a pair of flip-flops, shorts, casual shirts, whatever. Says, hey, John, nice to meet you. What. I said, Murray, can we have a talk? What are we going to do? Signals this, that, and the other. He says, John, it's very simple. He says, when I wink from the back of a scrum, you run that way. And if I wink with this eye from the back of the scrum, you run that way. And I learned more in that one game. Now, bear in mind, I was a British and Irish test player, and I learned more about number 8, number 9 play in that one game than I did in my whole previous life. And I learned when he played at Wanderers from him. I passed it on to Yanni Briet, and for a couple of years, we caused chaos at the back of scrums. So Murray is this wonderful, wonderful guy. And he was over here seeing a friend who's not too well. And I had breakfast with him, and you can imagine the memories and the talk and the chat. And I mentioned another great rugby friend of mine, the great Ollie Campbell, who was, again, one of the great fly halves of Irish and Lions history. He was a very good friend of mine. And Murray said, oh, Ollie Campbell, he said, I feel very, very guilty about him. I said, why? And he said, on the 1983 Lions tour to New Zealand, they were playing Wellington just before the first test. And Wellington had a tough side. And Wellington had realized that Ollie Campbell was the key to the Lions. They didn't have a great backline, but the halfbacks were good. And they thought if they can neutralize Ollie Campbell, that'll really go some way to making the game very competitive. So Murray, with some shame, said that he early tackled, he late tackled, he obstructed Ollie Campbell for the whole game. And then right near the end, he hit him with a late tackle, knocked him nearly into touch. The game ended. The Lions won a narrow victory. And then in the bar afterwards, when the players were mingling together, as I don't know if they do these days, they did in those days, Murray Mexted went up to Ollie Campbell, who's the most mild-mannered man you'll meet, and he put out his hand and said, Ollie, I'm Murray Mexted. Nice to meet you. And Ollie looked at him and said, I think we've already met, which I thought was one of the great ripostes in rugby. But sorry, I'm digressing, but I thought you'd like to hear those stories and memories of 2 of the all-time greats and 2 of my best friends.
No, it actually ties together well. We were going to talk about the Lions today. You talked about the Lions game there in New Zealand. Of course, this year is another Lions tour to Australia this time, and I thought it was a good idea to talk to a former Lion like yourself, get an idea of what it entails being a Lion. Why is it so been around for such a long time? The traditions, the cultures. Talk to me about being a Lion. Firstly, why is it such a big thing in the UK?
UK and Ireland. It's the only place in the world where representing your country is not the ultimate honor. It's this little quirk of history where, you as a youngster, you dream of playing for Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales. Obviously, getting that cap is your dream. But then there's this almost, I don't know, it's like the yellow brick road. Out of that movie where you can, if you're lucky, if you're good enough, and if you're lucky enough, you can achieve once every, I mean, it's now once every 4 years. In the early days of the Lions, it was like once or twice a decade, you know. Sometimes there wasn't a Lions tour for 15 years. And you can achieve this sort of honor that is so crazy. And as I say, you have to be good, you have to be in the frame. But also, you have to be lucky. You have to be lucky. I mean, we see this English centre now who's an absolute shoe-in for the Lions. He gets injured for the season, he's gone. He might never play for the Lions again. You get a guy like Ringrose, the Irish centre, who's been a wonderful player for 10 years now. And he's narrowly missed out on 2 Lions tours. He would have been a shoe-in for this tour. But suddenly, Gary Ringrose, suddenly, Ireland seem to have gone off the boil a bit. A couple of other centres are playing out of their skins. And you think that this great player, and he is a great, wonderful player, attack and defence, might miss out on a Lions tour. And so in a funny sort of a way, what defines a Lions tour is not the great players in the past who played. You know, your Gareth Edwards, your Phil Bennett's, your Mike Gibsons, your Jackie Kyles, your all these wonderful players. Bleddyn Williams, Jackie Matthews, I can go right back. But what defines a Lions tour really is the players who missed out on it. I bumped into Jonathan Davis, the great Welsh fly half, who was commentating on a game over here in South Africa some years ago now. And he looked at me and he said, you know, I'm jealous of you. I said, what do you mean, Jonathan? You had this incredible career. You went rugby league. You played for Britain in rugby league. You played for Widnes. You were a superstar. He said, but I never got a Lions tour. He said to me, you got a Lions tour, and I'm jealous about it. So guys like that never got a Lions tour. And so that sort of defines it, really. So I look back upon it with huge pride. And I thought I'd show you something now, which is the Lions cap. The first Lions tour was 1888, and then about 10 years ago, maybe less, they decided suddenly to award Lions caps, and it is the most beautiful thing that I possess, apart from my dear wife. This is the most beautiful thing that I possess. It's the most fabulous velvet. It comes in a beautiful case and so on. And they actually went back through history because there are, I think, something like only 700 Lions who've ever played. And of course, the living ones was easy enough. You found them, they presented the cap. But what about the ones who've passed on? So they had a whole legal process where they had to verify that the families were the real families of the guys going way back. And I can promise you there's not a British and Irish Lions player or family who doesn't treasure that. So this year, and at the beginning of the year, you would have confidently predicted that the Irish will make up the vast majority of the players on the Lions tour to Australia. But having had what for them is now considered a rather disappointing Six Nations, which is crazy. Imagine they won the Triple Crown and they finished third in the Six Nations and everyone's regarding it as a failure. In my days, we'd be have been doing laps of honor about that. But I'm trying to get across that a Lions is hugely special. And, you know, there's even been some talk, mainly from accountants, I think, that with the crown season, international rugby season, that they might do away with the British and Irish Lions. Well, I can promise you, MV, if they did that, there would be warfare. There would be a revolution from the players because they're never going to stand for that. It is a part of rugby history.
While you're taking out that cap of yours, you showed me some of those caps before we started recording, and there's actually quite a special thing that you've got with those caps. Show me the other ones you've got there while we're on it.
Well, while I was there, I took out my Irish cap, which is a little bit faded in the sun now. You only get one cap, or nowadays, if you get 100 caps, they award a gold cap, which is quite a new thing, because in my day, the thought of winning 100 caps was just totally impossible. So this is my Irish cap, and when I played, and we'll talk about the old amateur days of the Five Nations, now Six Nations, and I got that in the post. Some months after the season, that arrived in the post. And now when I see players being called up on their debut and given their cap and tears and awards, I think, gosh, what an opportunity wasted. But as you might know, I did play for the Springboks on an internal tour, and I was on the bench 4 times for them in official matches. But I never actually got a Springbok cap. But I actually have a Springbok cap. There is your Springbok cap. And you might notice it's got 100 underneath. And what happened was, on the very controversial Ireland tour in 1981, the first test happened to be, I think it was the first or the second, one in Cape Town, one in Durban. It was one of them, was the 100th test the Springboks had ever played. So as a special gesture, they gave the Irish team each a Springbok cap. So although I never got a Springbok cap officially, I do have a Springbok cap. And those 3 little caps sit in my rather bare trophy cabinet as pieces of absolute history for me, and wonderful, wonderful memories. I thought you might like to see them.
No, I would love to see them. I mean, I'm just thinking you chose to go, north of the or south of the Yxka. You should have gone north. You would have had more trophies in your cabinet.
well, I always tell the story about how, because when we arrived, the Blue Bulls were absolutely top of the pops, and the Transvaal side was very, very far down. So I tell the story as though it's true, but it's actually not. That I was going to Loftus the one day to play a game, and for some reason I was driving, and I stopped and asked a guy on the street corner, how do you get to Loftus? And he said, keep training, John, keep training.
Yeah, well, there you go. I wanted to talk to you about the Lions specifically. And the interesting thing for me is we saw it again with the Six Nations. When England plays Wales or England plays Ireland, or, whenever the home nations, if that's what you call it, play against each other, Scotland and the likes, they hate each other. I mean, it's fisticuffs, and it's, they go all the way. We saw our big derbies are in South Africa, for example. It's much more intense than a normal game. But now suddenly they go on an overseas tour, which happens every 4 years under a new coach and everything. Firstly, I want to talk to you about, how do they get these cultures, different teams, different ways of playing, different personalities? How do they get them to gel together? How does that work, firstly?
It's an incredibly difficult thing, and there's no absolute formula to it. I would say the key thing is the captain, obviously the coach, and the manager. Nowadays, they've got 20 coaches, as we know, that are more off-field staff than there are players on the field. But there have been tours where, on paper, the Lions have had a magnificent side. And I'll go back to 1966, when they led a tour. They went to New Zealand, who were the best team in the world at the time, had a wonderful, wonderful side, the Meads brothers, and players of that caliber. And the Lions should have picked Ray McLaughlin, the Irish prop, who was this genius. He was a physics genius, went on to be a top businessman. He was a wonderful scrummager. And he'd taken over the Irish team, and he had drilled into them a little bit of professionalism. They had 3-hour team meetings. They went through everything. And in fact, a lot of the players thought it was too intense. It was taking the fun out of it. But Ray McLaughlin should have been coach on that New Zealand tour. But because the powers that be in those days thought he was a little bit professional, and they left him out. And there was a Welshman called Alan Pask, and for some reason they left Alan Pask out, the late Alan Pask, number 8, and they picked Campbell Lamerton, this great big Scottish army major, to be a captain. And he simply, A, wasn't worth his place in the test side, and B, he wasn't the right man to captain. And as a result, this side that went off with unbelievable talent in their ranks had a very, very unhappy tour, and they ended up getting whitewashed in the series. And I've spoken to guys who were on that tour, and they say they don't even want to talk about it. I mean, for example, Campbell Lamerton's first team talk, apparently before one of the games, was, he says, we're doing this for Queen and country. Now, you can imagine what the guys from the south of Ireland thought about that, because that wasn't their queen and it wasn't their country, and it was a disaster. And Willie John McBride told me that they went training for their very first game, for the very first test, in a place called Queenstown, which is this beautiful holiday resort in New Zealand, except there wasn't a decent rugby club there. So they ended up doing their final training sessions before they moved to the first test on the grass beside the runway at the airport. Every little town in New Zealand has a small runway. And they were training there for a first test, doing their moves, and then they'd have to run off as a plane came into land. And that's how sort of amateur and badly organized it was. Then I look at a tour like 1968. 1968 to South Africa. They lost the series then, but they have had I believe, something like 18 reunions of that side. You know, they're all old men, even older than me. But that side had such a spirit on it that they've had 18 different reunions. My friend Roger Young, who lives down in the Cape, he's been one of the guys who's organized reunions. They had such a bond, such a spirit, such a wonderful, wonderful time. And you can't put your finger on it. There's something about a team that gels. And often what happens, and you're very right, at the beginning of a tour, there's a certain, how shall I say, wariness amongst the players. And on my tour in 1980, there'd been a terribly dirty match between Wales and England. And England had won the Grand Slam for the first time in donkey's years. And there'd been a filthy game at Twickenham. And the Welsh flanker, Paul Ringer, had been sent off. Now, nobody got sent off in rugby in those days. And it was a huge, huge disgrace. And the Welsh felt that they'd been cheated, and England felt that the Welsh had been dirty. And there was a big sort of nervousness and a wariness at the beginning of the tour. But that's where a captain comes in. A captain and a coach and a manager come in and say, you park your national jerseys at the door. We are now British and Irish Lions. And obviously in those days where you played, on my tour, I think we played 18 games. And in the tours before that, they used to play nearly 30 games. They were away for 3 months. So by the end of the tour, you were either an unhappy family or you were a happy family. And nowadays, of course, they play, 8 games on a tour, which just seems so crazy. But in the current climate, that's a lot of games. And I remember Mario Itoje being interviewed when he was the youngster. He went to, I think it was New Zealand as the youngest player on the tour. Fabulous, fabulous lock forward, and somebody who seems to be making a late runner as a possible captain for this Lions side. And he said he'd never drunk as much in his life. Because they went to the tour. The first thing they had to do was have a bonding session where they selected songs that they were going to sing, practice the songs, and they all got horribly, horribly drunk to bond with each other. And it struck me, you know, that in a funny way, when I was playing, a Lions tour gave us amateur players a couple of months experience of being a professional, because you were now training every single day instead of twice a month. You didn't have to worry about your job. All you had to worry about was playing rugby to the best of your ability, and underneath the table a little bit, getting paid for it. Nowadays, you have these totally professional sportsmen, unbelievable sportsmen, who go on a Lions tour and they get a short experience of what it was like being an amateur player, where the bonding and the fun and the singing and the courts and the judges and all those little traditions from a Lions tour come in. So in a funny sort of a way, there's almost been a complete reversal. We got a feeling for being a professional. Nowadays, they get a feeling for what it must have been like being an amateur. And my goodness, the players today love it. And there'll be a lot of tears when the selection is made, some with joy and some with unhappiness.
Yeah, we'll get to that just now. Apparently, they're going to make a big hoo-ha of the announcement. You know, a whole ceremony is going to be televised live
That's
from the
right.
OT. We'll see about that. But talking about the traditions and stuff you mentioned, I wanted to hear about that a bit more. Once you're now in the team, I know the Springboks, I think they have what they call the Kontiki, you know, where you have to, you know, where you sort of initiate it. Is there anything similar in the Lions setup? I mean, I'm sure that you just mentioned rituals and traditions must be a very important part of getting this team to gel together.
Yeah, in my, I mean, I came as a replacement before the first test, so I missed they always used to have a warm-up weekend. I think it used to be in Bournemouth or something like that, where they'd warm up and then they'd travel. And of course, there are a number of examples of players who turned up at the warm-up session and then either got injured or young Porter, this prop for Ireland, he got injured in the warm-up session and ended up missing out on a Lions tour. And I remember Andy Irvine, my year in 1980, he arrived and was told he had a hamstring injury, and suddenly he's got back on the train to Edinburgh and missed out on the tour. He came out later as a replacement. But I mean, in the Springboks used to have the traditions of the Tuck Committee, which was the discipline committee, which involved a lot of physical, nowadays it would be called abuse. But in our day, I mean, as I said, I missed the Lions if there was an initiation. But in the Irish team, when I started off, your initiation was on the last training session from, we used to train at Belvedere College, now Ollie Campbell Park. And you train there in the final session on the bus on the way back. The new players had to sing a song with the microphone on the bus, you know, the touring microphone, which I can tell you is so embarrassed if you're not a singer, and I'm not a singer, and that was your initiation. But the Springboks in the old days used to have some fairly savage initiations that involved physical abuse, but I think those days are gone. But they had a tradition on the Lions tours where they had a court, where they used to, after the game, have a court, and a couple of the players would be judges or defenders or prosecutors. And of course, if a guy had made a mistake, he might have to drink beers or sing a song or something like that. But I think each team will come up with its own traditions. But it's very a short time in which to establish those than the Lions tours today. But you can be sure at the end there'll be some great stories. Even talking to you about it, MV, the hairs on my arms are rising up.
Me
And
too.
I'm looking down at that red hat, and I cannot believe that I ended up being on a Lions tour and playing in a test. And it's going to be fabulous in Australia, because Australia, as you know, have had a shocking time of it. But there's a certain Joe Schmidt who is there. And I don't know if you've been watching any of the Super Rugby, but the Australian sides are looking better, and they're looking sharper, and they're looking more determined as well. Because, of course, they want their tilt at the Lions, because with tours only coming every 12 years, this is their one chance to play the Lions as well. So it's very exciting.
I want to just digress for a moment. I mean, the very first time we ever spoke, you told me, you just mentioned that you missed the initiation of the Lions. Tell me the story about when you got notification that you're going to be in the Lions now. What happened? I know that was quite a funny story. I love that.
I've told the story before, but as my wife Jenny would say, I've told every story before. But I was on the Leinster team. I broke my leg playing for Ireland in 1977 and missed out on the Lions tour then. And I thought that was my chance gone. And then a youngster called Colin Patterson came in, brilliant scrum half, who sadly ended his career in South Africa with torn knee ligaments against Grickwell and West. And so I captained the Leinster side to Romania. And Romania were a very tough side in those days. They had victories against Wales. They drew with Ireland. They beat Munster by 30 points. And Munster 2 years earlier had beaten the All Blacks. So they were a top, and they were fully professional. They were soldiers or policemen. Went on that tour, came back, and was going to dig the garden and have holidays. And I got a phone call from Ian Robertson, the great Ian Robertson, who was the doyen of commentators in rugby, himself a former Scottish international. Shame, not too well at the moment, but a good friend of mine. And he said that the Goshawks in Zimbabwe are having a game, and they want to get a couple of internationals. So Mike Bigger and myself, he said, would you like to come? Mike Bigger was the Scottish captain. And so we went over and we played for the Goshawks against the Quackers at Hartsveld in Bulawayo. And the British Lions had started their tour, British and Irish Lions. They were unbeaten. They played about 4 games. And just as we were warming up to go out in the game, there was a knock on the door, and the door opened, and a guy stuck his head in and said, is John Robbie there? Yeah. And he said, we've just got a phone call from Sid Miller in South Africa. You've got to play today and then join the British and Irish Lions. Terry Holmes, the scrum half, is injured. So people would know I was never the most physically active player. I didn't give or take too many knocks in my career, but that day I never went near anything. I stayed away from every confrontation and ended up on the tour. So I'll never forget Hartsveld in now Zimbabwe. And funnily enough, recently I ran into somebody who said, John Robbie? And I said, yes. He said, I was the guy who was told to stick my head into the dressing room and tell it you were a Lion. And yeah, great memories.
Just talk to me about the way the Lions play. I mean, a typical Barbarian side, I mean, they only play once, and they have about a couple of days, maybe at most, to prepare. But why are the Lions tours more successful than the individual teams? Harry pointed it out to me. When England goes to tour New Zealand or Australia or Wales goes to or whatever, they're never as successful as the Lions are. And typically you would think a team that's sort of, amalgamated, let's call it that, would not do as well, but typically they do better. How do they get those strategies to work properly?
In fact, you're totally wrong. And so is Harry totally wrong.
Mm.
If you look back on the history of the Lions, they are hugely unsuccessful. Now, bear in mind, they used to go to South Africa and New Zealand only. Australia used to be sometimes a warm-up game on the way to New Zealand. Now, in fairness, nobody who goes to South Africa or New Zealand, if you look back on history, was very, very successful. So the British and Irish Lions have actually been very unsuccessful, if you think about it. They won in 71 in New Zealand, which was unbelievable. They became only the second team to win a tour over there after the 1937 Springboks, that famous side. And then, of course, they won in 74, Willie John's side over here. But if you think about it, apart from one tour in Australia and one tour in South Africa, since then, they haven't won tours. So the Lions actually have been fairly unsuccessful. And that, of course, puts more and more pressure on them. And of course, with the tours being so short now, it means that they have very little time. I mean, at one stage, they would play 8 or 9 games building up to the first test. Now you get, I think, 3 games, if you're lucky, building up to the first test. So as I say, it depends a lot on how quickly they can get together. And nowadays, in the days of fully professional rugby, of course, that puts even more pressure on Andy Farrell and his team and getting the right guys in there. And also things like defence. As we know now that, I mean, defense, you used to come up in a line on the inside shoulder of your man and tackle your man. Nowadays, we have the push defense, the drift defense. We have the rush defense that has been made so famous by the Springboks. And it's such a vital part of play. And you wonder now, with so little time to adjust, will Farrell go for a national side's defense? Say, for example, will he pick Ireland at scrum half, fly half, maybe first centre, whatever. And that could come into it. And that's going to be one of the fascinating things. But the British and Irish Lions, when you think about it, 4 countries against 1 country. And, you know, in the past, the rugby populations of New Zealand and South Africa were tiny. There's more people playing rugby in one suburb of London than there are in the whole of New Zealand, even today, or up till recently. I'm not sure about the situation now. And so if you think about it, the Lions should have actually done much better in the past than they did. Go back and take 71 and 74 out of the list, and you'll see that the Lions have been actually spectacularly unsuccessful over the years. But they've got wonderful, wonderful talent. But there's that intangible something that makes a successful Lions tour or an unsuccessful Lions tour. And it actually has little to do with talent. It's how they get together. And as I said right at the beginning, your captain, your coach, and your manager are vital. When I joined, I'll never forget it. I flew down the next morning from Bulawayo, arrived in Joburg, flew to Cape Town. I was met by the official from the South African Rugby Union, flew along to Stellenbosch to open the Dani Craven Stadium at Kutsenberg. That was the Lions playing against the Leopards. I think it was the Leopards in those days, and I sat on the bench. And as I arrived, I had to rush in and get changed and try and learn the line-out signals while I was sitting on the bench. I remember Mike Slemon, the late Mike Slemon, lent me a pair of socks because we had our own Lions socks, but of course I didn't have any. These memories are coming back vividly. And I met Billy Beaumont, who wasn't playing because he was, you know, getting ready for the test. And I met Sid Miller, the Lions manager, and shook hands and had a photo outside the stadium. And Sid Miller put his hand in mine and he pulled me up close like this. And he said, "John, even if you don't play, from this moment, you're as much a British and Irish Lion as Willie John McBride, who went on 5 tours. And it didn't matter if I didn't play in those days. If you were a Lion, you were a Lion." Nowadays, they've changed it. And because there's been so many replacements, and because they have what they call geographical replacements, if they're playing in New Zealand and Wales happen to be in Australia, they'll bring replacements over, even though perhaps they weren't the best players. And I think it's very unfair, and it's gone against the tradition. We talked about tradition, because in those days, as I say, once you joined the Lions, even if you didn't play, now they say you have to cross the whitewash. You have to get onto the field to become a British and Irish Lion. And I'm against that. I think that goes against what was a lovely tradition.
This is a matter of interest. I was at Dani Craven Stadium on Monday night. I watched Marties versus Ikeys.
Oh, wow.
And what an experience. I tell you what, the most beautiful stadium I've ever watched rugby in. There's no doubt about it.
Well, Francois Pina is the guy, because if you know, or remember, whatever it was, a decade or maybe more ago, University Rugby was dead. all the decent players were playing for the academies, and university rugby had become something of a joke. And Francois Pienaar looked at American college football, and he said, college football is bigger than NFL. And he said, because it's the biggest party in town, it's a huge party that they attach to a rugby game to. And now you look at the crowds and the stadiums and the rugby, and it's wonderful. So Francois Pienaar, take a bow, because as well as winning the World Cup as captain, he also did a fantastic thing with university rugby. And I think that sometimes we forget that.
On the subject of traditions, the one thing I didn't like is they played music the entire match. I mean, I've been having a bit of a go at the Bulls for playing music in between, but in breaks between play. These guys just never stop playing music.
Answer me one question. Yeah. Why is it, now we're in the 2020s now, why is it when you turn on a rugby game in New Zealand, in South Africa, in England, in Ireland, in Scotland, everywhere, at some stage in the game, you'll hear Sweet Caroline by Neil
I don't know. That guy would be coining it in royalties.
Become such a rugby? And I find myself singing along, watching on the television. Why has the rugby music stayed in the 70s when rugby has moved on? But anyway, that's a rhetorical question, MVA.
Anyway, let's move on. Like you just said, let's talk about this year's Six Nations. And like we said, a lot of players were shoo-in favourites to make the Lions team. Andy Farrell actually took a bit of a sabbatical to focus on the Lions, and he brought Simon Easterby in to coach the Irish team. Talk to me about what you saw during the Six Nations of these players that can be selected. Before we go and speak about France and Italy and the likes, who stepped up, who took a bit of a reputational knock, if I want to call it that. What were the impressions of the Six Nations?
Well, Ireland are the ones who took a knock. And I say it's extraordinary because if you think about it, they only lost one game, which was a very, very, well, no, they were hammered by France. And they won the Triple Crown, which in my day was a huge thing. I mean, Ireland won the Triple Crown in 1948 and 1949, and we were brought up on that being the golden era of Irish rugby. Now the Triple Crown is almost a sideshow. And going into this Six Nations, Andy Farrell would have hoped Ireland, who are, if you remember, strong favourites in the Six Nations, maybe with France, but with a home game against France, most people, I think, including me, would have tipped Ireland for perhaps a third championship. And overall, their performance was very disappointing. I mean, they won their games, but their defense looked incredibly leaky. And somehow, that aura of invincibility has gone. I mean, it's a bit like the Australian Test cricket side of the 90s, the 2000s, the All Blacks, maybe the way the Springboks are now. There was that era of the aura of invincibility that you thought about Ireland. No matter how they play, no matter what happens, they're going to come and they're going to bash you in the end. And of course, that was based on the success of my old Leinster side who've done well. Suddenly, the Irish are looking a bit ponderous. Suddenly, their set piece, the line-out has looked a little bit dodgy, certainly early on. They don't seem to have speed on the outside. You look at the way the French team play, they get it to their wingers. They are electric. Even this little Italian player is absolutely electric. You look at the Scottish players, their wingers, electric. England are bringing players in now. And for all his undoubted talent, James Lowe is suddenly looking a little bit ponderous. The outside Irish backs are not running like they used to. Even Hugo Keenan, who has had 2 or 3 magnificent years as fullback, is looking slightly human. So I think that Andy Farrell, much as Clive Woodward would have hoped for the 2005 Lions. Do you remember his great English team that won the World Cup in 2003? And he desperately wanted that English team to stay on for 2005. And they'd gone just over the top. And he made the mistake of picking them all and getting away with it by picking dozens of other players. And he tried to get that England side into the Test side, and it didn't work. So Andy Farrell has a huge decision to make. Does he stick with the Irish guys he knows, even though they're a little bit, dare I say, over the hill? And maybe that's an unfair thing to say because, as I say, they still all but won one game. Or does he say, I'm going to now pick on merit? But that's a big question he has to ask.
How much of this lack of form almost, or sort of deterioration of form in Ireland is due to Simon Easterby being the coach, new coach. Not saying he's a bad coach by any means. He's probably going to be with Andy Farrell on the Lions too as well. Just that adjustment to a new coach, firstly, and secondly, due to the fact that the Irish maybe didn't manage the succession that well. The squad is aging, and there's not really some players that can step into the void. What do you think happened there?
It's very difficult to say if you're not inside. I mean, Easterby's an amazing guy. He comes from the north of England, played rugby in Wales, but in Wales, lives in Wales, but coaches in Ireland. And funnily enough, coincident, is married to the daughter of Elgin Rees, the Lions winger who played on my tour. Very, very fast winger who played for Neath. And it's very tough to say. I mean, they always say the changeover is seamless when a sort of an assistant coach takes over for a coach, but it isn't like that. But unless you're inside the camp, it's very, very hard to say. I think Ireland, their loss in the last Rugby World Cup to New Zealand, I think, having beaten the Springboks, I think that was a massive, massive blow to Ireland. I think that the players were so up for that, and then losing people like Johnny Sexton, who was an absolute talisman. And I don't know if you've read his biography. It's called Obsessed, and it's well worth reading because it gives you an insight into the brain of this extraordinary guy, even though he pissed off a lot of people because he was so obsessed with rugby. I think it's more that the succession, as you talked about managing, hasn't been done properly. But it's very, very difficult when your team is winning 2 championships in a row. They go out narrowly to New Zealand in the World Cup. How do you drop those guys who perform so well? It's very, very difficult to say. And what do you do now? I mean, we've seen this French team emerge from sides that did brilliantly in the under-20 Six Nations. They had a succession of teams that did brilliantly. And now, to my amazement, because we've talked about the Irish academy systems and the school systems, and now the clubs feeding into 4 provinces and into this international side, they got the wooden spoon in the under-20 championships. Ireland under-20 came last, behind Italy, behind Wales, behind Scotland, everybody else. And so I think looking forward, Ireland we've seen an era change, and now they're going to have to manage picking it up. But as I keep coming back to it now, the selection process for this Lions tour is going to be very difficult. And the other side of it is, I mean, the coach obviously, and I said this earlier, and I sound like I'm contradicting myself, but the coach, as a rule, will go with the devil he knows. You got 2 players and it's a toss-up, you'll go with the guy you know. But if ever, this is another thing that can ruin a Lions tour, if ever there's a suspicion that the coach is not picking on merit, that the coach is picking because of his own team, that can destroy team spirit. That can absolutely destroy team spirit. And Andy Farrell will be aware of that. But quite what goes on in the inner sanctum. And again, this is something I've spoken to you about, the documentary Chasing the Sun, that everybody loved so much, this fly on the wall view of the Springboks, and they've done ones with the Lions tours. I hate them. I'm totally against them. I think they're treasonous. It's blasphemous to go into that inner circle of a rugby team, which for me was something that I have going back, and my team had, and it's there, and it's ours, and it's nobody else's. And even though it made fabulous television, that sort of opened up that window into what makes a team very, very special. And maybe it'll only be after the tour that we discover exactly what's going on in that inner sanctum. But Farrell has some very, very tricky decisions to make. And of course, the one of them is captain. Who's going to be captain on the tour? Because boy, that's a tough job.
Yeah, one of the favourites for captain, like you mentioned right at the beginning, is Maro Itoje, who's now suddenly sort of taken England a step up, being a captain. Like you said, talk to the referee properly, but he's a hard man. He's a hard man. He takes no prisoners. That's the kind of leader that you wanted. But you also mentioned to me earlier, before we started recording, that's not all a captain is about. The captain of the Lions needs to, like we talked about, pull these guys together, guys from different teams, different countries for that matter. What exactly does a Lions captain have to be successful?
Well, I would suggest that, a Lions tour will be judged by his history on how it does on the field. but the players will judge it almost off the field, whether it was just the greatest experience of their life. And I would argue that the Lions captain's biggest job is off the field. Off the field is his job. And Itoje seems to be this very quiet individual. And I saw some, because the English media are now punting Itoje big time as a captain, and that's what the media does. And I saw a report saying that the way he talks to the referees and questions decisions in that very polite way, and he got some decisions, and this is all counting in his favor. But I would argue it's when you've got your Welsh star centre or Scottish star winger who's got a twinge in his hamstring and hasn't made the first test, and he's devastated, and he's talking of going home injured. And you put your arm around that guy and say, look, you're needed. We need you. And I'll give you an example of I think the greatest captaincy decision. And this was told to me by Stuart McKinney, the Irish flanker from Dungannon and Ulster, who went on the 74 tour as a sort of an outsider. He was an outsider pick, but was he didn't make the test side, but he was a very successful tourist. And he said the very, very first day they got together at Bournemouth, which was, I told you, that weekend camp they used to have before they flew off. And Wales at that time were ruling the roost. They were so much better than anyone else except France, who of course didn't qualify for the Lions. And Gareth Edwards, who we now know was basically working for Adidas. You know, if you wanted boots, you went to Gareth Edwards for a new pair of boots. And he was probably earning a lot of money. I won't say he was, because that's unfair. But Gareth was the Adidas man. And he was the star player on the Lions tour, or one of the star players. And he had a bunch of T-shirts, Adidas T-shirts, and he was going to the players. They were sitting down a water break during the training session, and he was giving out the T-shirts to the Welsh players. And Willie John McBride said, Gareth, he said, would you collect those T-shirts again? He said, I have no objection to getting side stuff and gifts and even stuff under the table. He said, I don't mind that at all. But it goes to all 30 players. If it doesn't go to all 30 players, it's simply not on. And in that one gesture, the whole of the Lions squad knew this guy means business. We're all in it together. It's not Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales. And if you remember, when they won the series in the Battle of Butter Erasmus, that probably the dirtiest rugby game that's ever been played. And if you go and Google it now, the Battle of Butter Erasmus, 1974, you'll see things that today wouldn't have got players sent off. You'll see things that would have got players put in jail today. And at the end of that game, the Lions team lined up in front of the grandstand and applauded the dirt trackers. They applauded the players who hadn't made the test side, because they said, you were the ones who kept us going. You were the ones who supported us. You were the ones who stood in. You were the ones who trained against us for test matches, etc. So it's that on a Lions tour, which is very, very important. And I don't know enough about Itoje's background. He's been on 2 Lions tours, which would give him a huge advantage over Doris, who's also a magnificent player. And I think you would say Itoje is guaranteed of a test place, because some of the biggest disasters on Lions tours have been when a captain has not been guaranteed his test place. And you think of Kieran Fitzgerald in 1983, when the Scottish hooker, they didn't bring Peter Wheeler because I think they thought he was a better player than Fitzgerald. They brought the Scottish hooker. And then in that 66 tour, when Campbell Lamerton wasn't the best or second best lock in the party. So all sorts of decisions, but ultimately history will decide.
Oh, you talked about Wales now. Wales ruling the roost. I mean, those were the days. Warren Gatland's return did not pan out the way they wanted it to. What's happening in Wales? I mean, there are good players there. Jack Morgan, he's an immense player, but playing in a losing side. He's probably a shoe-in for the Lions as well. I'm not sure about the test position, but such an unfair thing. I mean, it's not the players that are not performing, it's the Wales structure. If I understand it correctly, that's not
I simply don't know. I think that you have to remember, Wales always had a tiny it's a tiny population. How many people in Wales? 3 million people or 2 million people, but it's not far off New Zealand. But I mean, Ollie Campbell told me that he heard a rumor that in Bridgend, which was the Town, of JPR Williams, of Steve Fenwick. I mean, so many wonderful players played for Bridgend. And there's not one school playing rugby, that they're playing soccer now. Soccer has taken over as the main game in Wales. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but they've also had problems at committee level, and they also have financial problems. You know, I mean, at one stage, the players had to take a pay cut. And the one thing is, if you're out there struggling and you've signed a contract and then you're told to take a pay cut, that doesn't go down well at all. Also, I suppose they've coincided with a lot of top players. You know, you think of your Alan Wynne Jones, you think of your Justin Tippericks, you think of all that golden era that won Grand Slams for Wales. A lot of them retired at the same time. So I think the problems in Wales have coincided with a slight dip in talent, but then their under-20s seem to have done quite well. As I say, Ireland got the wooden spoon, and I hope they come back. I mean, I was at Cambridge University, and my mother was Welsh and came from a place called Mountain Ash. And I was with the late Eddie Butler, who was a good friend of mine. He played for Pontypool in Wales. And we had a few beers, and I said, oh, I'd love to play club rugby in Wales because of my family ties and because Welsh club rugby is so good. And I woke up the next morning and he told me, you're playing for Pontypool on Saturday. Now, I was a seasoned Irish rugby international. I captained Leinster. I was there. And when I went to Pontypool, I felt like I was stepping up a level. And that's the way Welsh rugby was in those. I played with a Leinster side that went to Llanelli. And it was like a group of amateurs going to a professional side. And we were absolutely hammered. And yet a couple of years later, we'd caught up and we were beating those sides. So I don't know what the answer to Welsh rugby is, but all I know is it needs a cool head. It needs someone to take stock and someone to start looking at the next generation and bring them through. And yeah, it's gone beyond a joke. Let me put it that way.
I want to ask you a bit of an unfair question, but this issue of promotion relegation, is there a space for it? Or will it be sacrilege to let Wales play a promotion relegation against Georgia, for example, and then lose and fall out of the Six Nations?
I mean, in fairness, you have to have it. Why should a team be guaranteed their place where another team is pushing and doing, you know, a golden generation is coming through of Georgians, relatively speaking. But the thought of Wales not being in the championship is unbelievable. I mean, you think of the Springboks back in 1965, where they lost to New Zealand and they lost to Ireland and they lost to Scotland and they even lost to the Irish universities. Can you believe it? An Irish university side beat the Springboks in 1965. And teams go through a down. They go through a down. And as I say, maybe Wales are just having an extended down now. But having said that, in fairness, you know, why should a team that's constantly that is above them on the log, on the rankings. I'm not a great one for the rankings, but a team that is there, why should they not have a playoff? All I know is if Wales got relegated, that would be the death knell. A little kid growing up, I mean, you think of Gareth Bale, who went on to play for Southampton, Tottenham Hotspur and Real Madrid, probably one of the greatest Welsh soccer players ever. He had a choice at school. He was a brilliant winger. He was a brilliant winger in rugby and a brilliant winger in soccer. Now, I can tell you, if Wales get relegated in rugby, all those players who could play both will start playing soccer, not rugby, and it's the end. I just hope the people running rugby will take into account tradition, take into account economics, take into account all sorts of things and make the right decision. But like people talking about the Springboks playing in the European Championship in the Seven Nations, as it would be, it just goes against the grain. For Wales to be relegated just doesn't feel right. But then maybe I'm a little bit biased to envy it.
Before we speak about England, let's talk about Scotland. Like once again, talk about this is Scotland's year. This year they're going to do it, and once again they failed to deliver. Ended fourth once again. Talk about Franco Smith maybe taking over from Gregor Townsend. Maybe it's time for a bit of a change in the coaching regime. Your thoughts?
Yeah, Scotland are playing wonderful rugby. Even in that first half against France, I thought they were in with a shout. And you know, even though some of their top players are New Zealanders, Australians, or South Africa, those are the rules. And I love watching Scotland play. I will watch Scotland play anytime. And there's something wonderful about it. And when you think how poor they were some years ago, but they just can't seem to get that consistency. They can't seem to get that consistency for 80 minutes in a game, and they can't seem to get that consistency over a season. But I love watching them play, and I love the style they play, and I love the way Glasgow and Edinburgh have come up and are competing at top level. Do you change the coach? You know, we've talked about Easterby and Farrell and the possible negative side that has had. So I simply don't know the inner dynamics. What I do know is that you can't get a ticket for Murrayfield. And when I look at Edinburgh and I look at Glasgow, those grandstands are full. And I'm sure there's a lot of young Scottish kids who are saying, I want to be a rugby player now instead of something else. So I just don't think they have the level of depth and forward play in particular. You know, nowadays, if you don't have an absolutely dominant pack, it's very difficult to win something like a World Cup, for example. You know, you can have that high and then suddenly you're going to get a low, and in a knockout phase you're going to go. But I love seeing Scotland play, and Duan van der Merwe is very, very special. And there's a side of me would have wished he was playing for the Springboks, I must say.
Oh, he actually made his mark in Varsity Cup, like you just mentioned earlier.
Yes, yeah.
For that matter.
Classic example. Classic example.
Talking about that, Piers Koeman is an old office boy. He plays prop there. He's probably one of these favourites to go on this tour, Duan van der Merwe. But the big question mark about the Lions going forward is who's going to be at 10. Is it going to be Finn Russell? Is it going to be Finn Smith? Sam Prendergast, I wanted to ask you about him, and when we talked about Ireland, slipped my mind. Your thoughts on a fly-off for the Lions? I know we just...
Fly-off, key position. Key position. You think about it, no really successful Lions has gone without halfbacks. In fact, no team can do it if you don't have dominant halfbacks. I mean, you know, Gareth Edwards, Barry John, Gareth Edwards, Phil Bennett. They were the basis of the team, and the rest of the side has to protect them and let them do their stuff. And let me just say, as an aside, this rule, which I hate, which is the scrum half having to retreat backwards behind the number 8. Instead of trying to harass the scrum half and the number 8 on this side. I understand what they're doing, which is to take less pressure off the attacking scrum half, the one with the ball. But what it's actually doing is giving another defender, giving another player who can stand back and who can move. But having said that, to watch Dupont, the way he conducts a game, when he's standing behind that scrum with no basically threat on either side. So there's a supposed argument each way. Finn Russell is one of these guys who's mercurial. He's obviously slightly bonkers. You know, he had that run-in with Gregor Townsend some years ago where I think he was found having a few beers the night before, something like that, which is ironic because in my day, the night before a test match, you had to have a couple of beers. We used to go out to O'Donoghue's pub, and you had to have two beers, 2 Guinnesses. And when I first played for Ireland as a 20-year-old, I didn't drink. And there was me drinking 2 pints of Guinness, and I was half pissed when I went home to the hotel. So it's ironic how things have changed. The goal kicking, I mean, that blemish he had with his goal kicking, missing those 3 kicks. You know, you cannot go into a Lions test series, well, to go into any big rugby match without a 5 out of 6 goal kicker. You know, you cannot go in with a guy who'll kick you 6 out of 6 one day and 1 out of 6 the next. You need a guy who'll kick you 5 out of 6 every single time. And that's the big worry I would have about Finn Russell. When you look at this young Irish guy who's come through, Prendergast, I mean, he just doesn't look like a fly half. He's so tall. I mean, he's about 6'5", lanky. The one thing I've been, because of all the hype, I've actually been slightly disappointed in it. You know, he makes a lot of mistakes as well as the good things that he does. But enough players that I respect say he's got something special. And the one thing is he's got the ability to take the ball and hold it and then delay that pass so he either skips or he pops it up to someone into the gap. And you look at the number of breaks that come through from that right decision. You think about it, he runs up against his marker, he has the ball here, the guy outside doesn't know whether he comes in tight to take the guy taking the pop pass or drift to take the long pass. And that moment of indecision can cause a lot of damage done. And he seems to have that ability. Crowley also has missed kicks at his time, vital kicks at his time. And I think that the decision, how can I say, the slight weaknesses in those two players reminds us just how good Johnny Sexton was, how good he was, for the criticisms about his attitude, about some of his behavior, some of the things he said after games, etc., because he was so obsessed with the game. I think this focuses just on how good they were. I think probably, excuse me, I would think that Finn Russell and maybe Smith, Finn Smith, coming from, it's Finn Smith, isn't it? The English fly half, a very popular name these days. There were no Finns in my time. I think they might be the two travelling fly halves, with possibly Prendergast going. But of course, they've probably got Marcus Smith as the dreaded utility back to go. So I would think that could be your selection. But goal kicking is important. You have to have a goal kicker to win a test series, and whether they're good enough, consistent enough, I simply don't know.
Talk about England. Harry and I talked about England this weekend. Are they now proper contenders? They started slowly, lost against Ireland, but not badly. And then as the tournament progressed, they got better and better and better, and they ended on a high, ended second. You know, this is a team on the up.
I have said next World Cup, this is a team that is just coming to the boil very, very nicely. And it's the backline players that are coming through. England have always had the forwards. They've always had a terrific, big pack of forwards. And now it's interesting that they've gone for speed in the back row. And this young Pollock, this Earl, the two Curry brothers, it's almost as though they've sort of said, look, line out we can cover, but the one thing you can't coach is speed. And they are going to go fast, and they've got these fast backs coming in with incredible skill. And except for France, who are magnificent. The French side at the moment is simply magnificent. And the speed that they've got right through their back line is something incredible. And that's, as I say, is the one thing that worries me about Ireland at the moment. That top line speed is something maybe they haven't got. But with the exception of France, the one side I would look ahead to the next World Cup and would frighten me as a South African ex-Irishman would be England. They've got, but England in the past often seem to blow things, make bad decisions, but they seem to be on a little bit of a path. And the fact that they started off so badly in terms of results under Borthwick, in terms of the way they played, in terms of the way they didn't get the results, and also the unpopularity, they were an unpopular side. Now, as they've progressed through this championship, they've played some wonderful, wonderful rugby. And there's a buzz about England. There's a nice age profile across the England side. And I would say they're a team to watch. And for the first time in my life, I actually enjoy watching England play. You know, coming from Ireland, I've never been the greatest England supporter, if I can put it that way. I'm kidding, of course. Some of my best friends are English. But England were always quite an unpopular side because they've so many players. Their fans, once they get on top, can be a little bit, dare I say, boorish. And in fact, the English fans used to be a little bit what like Irish fans are now. And I hate to go back on it, but Irish fans in general piss me off at the moment. I think they've got a little bit swept away with the success that the side has enjoyed. And just maybe this little hiccup, winning the Triple Crown, you know, and finishing, only losing one game, we call a hiccup now. In my day, we'd have celebrated for half a year after a result like that. But maybe it'll just bring Ireland down a little peg or two and get them back to where they used to be, which was, I think, the best fans in the world.
Harry, I had quite an interesting podcast a little while ago, that game where England beat France. We found ourselves supporting England, and to us it was a bit of a shock, you know, how on earth did that happen? You know, I'm a South African, how I feel about England. So that was an interesting one. I enjoyed that. I'm glad to hear you feel the same way. You mentioned France just in passing, it's got nothing to do with the Lions, but this French team is, you talk about the team on the up, they've now defined their own 7-1 bench for that matter. Very fast. Louis Bielbiaré is probably one of the fastest players I've ever seen. 8 tries in one tournament. I mean, that's unheard of. I think there's 6 assists as well. That guy's next level. France as a team, I think in the next World Cup, you talk about a favorite to me, apart from Springboks, France probably the favourites going into 2027.
But what's the first thing they've got? They've got a goal kicker who, if he misses, it's a shock, even if it's from the touchline.
Vamos.
And in fairness, it's a bit like Andre Pollard in the big games. You know, I would put my life on Andre. And you look what he's done in big games in the past when it's come down to that kick against France, against the All Blacks, no matter where it is. You feel confident as he steps up to the ball. He's ice cold in his veins. And this Ramos is the same. And he's got that weird little sort of almost soccer chip kicking style that he brings it in from the right and hooks it in. So you start off with probably the best goal kicker in the world. You look at the speed they've got on the outside. You look at the size they've got up front. And then the incredible thing is, I mean, as a former scrum half, Anton Dupont, I hate him. I absolutely loathe him and wish he wasn't here because he makes me and every other scrum half look bad, except perhaps Just and Fourie and who else? Ken Catchpole and Gareth Edwards. Apart from the legends, he makes the rest of us look deficient. I mean, what a wonderful player. But look at the replacement who came in. This guy who I'd sort of never heard of. He comes in from, I think, Bordeaux Bègles. And with his bald head, and you think, who is this guy? And you look at this passing, you look at his decision making, and so that indicates a strength and depth to me. But the physical side of the French is incredible. Those centres, the way they take people on, and Aldrit at number 8 is one of the best because not alone does he have that physical power and speed, you can just see that his brain is working all the time, and hopefully Dupont will be back, although torn, smashed knee ligaments like that. There was nothing untoward in it as well. I was very disappointed in Galtier suggesting that there was something dirty. There isn't. At that level, that you cannot afford. Nobody goes out to you go out to hammer a guy, but you won't go out to injure a guy. But hopefully he'll be back. But he's a wonderful player, and the balance of that French side, you just feel they all know what they're doing, and they play with an absolute delight. They love playing. I mean, you watch when they win a turnover ball, immediately they're looking for the open spaces. And you can see the forwards, the back row, the scrum half screaming to get into position to support. So that looks to me like a happy side. The Irish side at the moment to me doesn't look like a happy side. The Welsh side, certainly not a happy side. And I certainly hope that the Lions, when they get select, will be a happy Lions team, because that'll stay with them for the rest of their lives.
Of course, we play Italy 3 times this year. The Springboks, and Italy once again, promised a lot but failed to deliver at the end. They've got some very, very good players. You mentioned it before, Menoncello, for example, and they just don't get there. Just briefly, your thoughts on Italy as an opponent for the Springboks?
Yeah, I mean, you would expect the South Africans simply to be too strong up front. But Italy, I think, are on a learning curve. And once again, when you watch the Zebra games, when you watch the other team they've got, what's the other one? Benetton, sorry, forgive me, Benetton, yeah. Zebra Benetton. You pick up a vibe there. You pick up supporters there who are passionate about it. You see youngsters coming through. You see them winning under 20 games. So I simply don't know underneath what they've got coming through. I simply don't know. Are there the players coming through? But I love watching them play. And this little wing fullback they've got, what's his name? Cabuso. What's that guy's name? I'm terrible with names. Yeah. That little flyer they've got who plays for, I think, Toulouse or Toulon now.
I know exactly what you're talking about, the right wing. Yeah. I
Yeah,
can't remember the name number either.
Yeah. Sorry. So you get to my age now. Funnily enough, the names in the 1960s and 70s I can remember. I can't remember the names of the guys.
Same, yeah.
The games now. But I must tell you a great story about my great teammate Moss Keane was the famous Irish lock forward. And just to give you an idea how things have changed from the old amateur days, I heard a lovely story recently that they were running out in Twickenham, Ireland against England. And Moss was running, the two teams were running out, or were together in the tunnel. And the great English flanker, Tony Neary, who came here in 1974, brilliant player. Broughton Park he played for, didn't get in the test side because of Fergus Slattery, but great guy, ran into a few problems business-wise in life, but that's another thing. And as they were going out, Tony Neary said to Moss Keane, "Hey Moss," he said, "may the best team win." And Moss said, "I hope not."
That's brilliant.
which I thought, and there was also the story of Willie Duggan, who used to always have a cigarette, the last thing he did before he went out to play. And I vividly remember in the old dreadful dressing rooms in Athletic Park, New Zealand, and they had these dungeon-like dressing rooms, and amazingly you had to go up the stairs and there was a toilet sort of up in the top corner of the dressing room. I've never seen anything like it. And I remember warming up to play the All Blacks and seeing the smoke rising from outside the toilet where Willie was having his last cigarette. And there was a famous game where they were playing England in Lansdowne Road. And as he ran out onto the field, he realized he still had the cigarette in his mouth to go out and play a test match. So in panic, he gave it to the referee, Jack Short, who was at the gate letting the players on. So you had the referee left holding a cigarette. So those are the sort of memories that I have. And once again, it just demonstrates amateur versus professional. But it's lovely in the days where we complain about a negative play and defensive play and over kicking and so on, how many tries are being scored. So I think that's lovely to see. As long as it never becomes like basketball where you have scores every couple of moments. The balance, I think, is just right.
John, I'm going to have to let you go. I would have spent another hour talking to you, probably 2 hours.
Lovely.
Well, I'm definitely going to press you on your button for the Lions tour. I mean, we must please make a plan to talk to each other. When
I can't wait. And I'm so delighted Joe Schmidt is there. Because what he did for Ireland was magnificent, for Leinster, for Ireland. And like Wales, Australia, we need a strong Australian side. And I can see those little green shoots coming through now. But we'll talk about that another day. Great to talk to you, Envia. I have to go to the shops now, so I have to go. But this bar is waiting for you and your wife. And we're going to have a hell of an evening here.
I'm going to take you up on it. Thanks, man. I really appreciate it, John. Enjoy your shopping. We'll talk again soon.
Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you.
It's the Lekker Rugby Inside Story Series.